The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay. I'm your host, Len B.A., and I am honored to have as my guest today Anupam Saraph. Acclaimed as being astonishingly creative and an educator in the best sense of the word, Anupam Saraph has been making the magic of systems leadership accessible to institutions and individuals across Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. He has brought inspiring insights and empowered unconventional interventions through his methods. In 1994, systems thinker Donella Meadows highlighted that Anupam had invented a new kind of modeling and a new philosophy that recognized for the first time that systems arise ultimately out of consciousness, that the most profound way to understand a system is to understand its consciousness, and that the most inexpensive, elegant, and lasting way to change a malfunctioning system is to change its consciousness. The resulting field of possibility innovation has enabled innovative and impact-making designs and responses that shape futures of systems and the institutions and individuals they sustain. Since then, Anupam has empowered systems leadership across the United Nations, World Economic Forum, Club of Rome, governments and public institutions across continents, NGOs, small, medium, and large businesses, as well as communities, bringing the art of possibility, responsibility, and empathy to their worlds. He also mentors and builds capacity for systems thinking, writes columns, and finds connection, energy, and joy in deep conversations, reading, music, and being with nature, particularly wildlife, freshwater streams, mountains, and wilderness. He occasionally dabbles in watercolors, gardening, and harmonium. Anupam Saraph, welcome to Talk of the Bay.
Honored to be here with you. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. You have been involved in formal systems thinking for a long time. Everyone, at least at some point, engages in systems thinking without giving it a name or maybe being aware that it's any different from all the times they don't think systemically. Could you give us an explanation of systems thinking and why it's valuable?
I'm often asked, what are systems? And I usually ask people to do a small exercise in order to discover the world of systems that they are immersed in. It's a simple exercise. Just close your eyes and think about your typical day. Start at the time that you wake up to the time that you go to bed. And I want you to think about each of the person or things that you interact with during the passing of a day. Then I want you to think about the purpose of your interaction. And then finally, I want you to put a name to each group that you interact with, or each person or thing that you interact with. Put a name to the relationship. Each of these relationships or each of these groups is usually what we call as a system. And so during the course of your day, you are actually part of several systems. And to recognize what are these systems that you are a part of will help you to recognize which of these systems are those that fill your day with joy, fulfillment, and wonder and enchantment, and which of these systems bring you down, exploit you, abuse you, or make you feel disempowered. So in a sense, your ability to recognize your systems decides how you feel and how you can experience and ensure that you live in a world which is empowering and full of fun and joy, and helps you to feel, uh, find your dignity and find your space in the world around you.
Wow, that's really profound because when we begin to look, as I look at the individual actions or interactions that I have, certainly some are as any person in the modern world would expect. Some are simply annoying, feel like a waste of time, feel like they're robbing me of my energy. Some things are very attractive. I seek them out. I want to be interacting with in certain kinds of in certain kinds of spaces with certain groups, certain people. In my case, not so much things, but there are probably if you're when you're working, I certainly interact with musical instruments, and so that's something that I could consider a nurturing and positive. There's kind of a feedback process there, right? But to look at it from that perspective of what's the underlying purpose, and then what struck me immediately in trying to follow your exercise is oftentimes what we might call the declared purpose or the original purpose no longer seems to hold. That is, it's now contradicted by how the process is conducted, so that the original purpose is in many ways undermined. And I think we can probably begin to think of many examples of that. But is that an appropriate reaction to how that looks?
You're absolutely right. I think the purpose is what brings us together for interacting. And it is essentially, the purpose which decides the systems that we are a part of. If those who come together to interact do not share the same purpose, do not have a common purpose, you are likely to experience all the annoyance and irritation and disempowerment that you might experience. On the other hand, if you do share a common purpose, it's more likely that you are going to experience a sense of joy and fulfillment of working together towards common purposes. So it's important to recognize that every time you come together to interact with somebody, you are forming systems. And it's your purposes for the interaction which are the reason why systems get formed.
And a lot of us, I mean, we're particularly in what I'll call, a developed economy like the United States, highly industrialized, a lot of human-made environments. The systems predate us, and we're simply stepping into a role in that system. And I wonder if you could talk about how systems actually shape our relationships in ways that we might not consciously intend.
You're right that there are many interactions during the course of our day that we have inherited from history, and the systems or the interactions and their purposes have been invented for us. And in that sense, they are invented, they are designed. They can therefore be reinvented. And that is the space of possibility open to us to actually reinvent the interactions and the purposes for which we interact. I think when you notice your day, you will notice that in some part of the day you might be a buyer or you might be a seller. And when buyers and sellers come together, you form a market system. However, often we describe a market in terms of demand and supply. We rarely describe it in terms of interaction between buyers and sellers. And you will recognize that if the buyers are exploiting the sellers or vice versa, this system is going to cause problems for both the participating actors. It's going to make them feel annoyed, irritated, exploited, abused. Uh, on the other hand, if they share a common purpose of exchanging what is in surplus with each other, and they do a fair exercise in their interactions, they're likely to feel empowered. They're likely to find that this is something which is fulfilling in part of their day. And therefore, it's important to really recognize how did we inherit these interactions and how did we actually come to design them, or who designed them for us, and what are the purposes for which we are interacting. And therefore, when we come up with ideas of regulating systems, we need to recognize what is the need for which the actors are interacting with each other. What are their purposes? So it's important to be able to recognize that in order to uh, deal with the baggage of each of the systems that we have inherited, in order to be able to find joy and find possibility and find empathy and also be responsible to what we do every day.
You've worked with governments and NGOs and particular organizations to apply the systems thinking to the problems they're trying to address. Could you give an example of that? Because it's so clear that having traveled in other parts of the world and gone to a marketplace where you actually have to negotiate a price with the actual producer of the thing and buy it, and it's very personal. It's person to person. It seems so much of those interactions, at least in the United States, is mediated by some sort of institutional form. There's a supermarket chain, or there's if you're purchasing material to do some work, like as a contractor, if you're buying materials, all your supply chain relationships are very dependent on manufacturers' timelines and wholesalers' policies and on and on and on. So could you give an example? It doesn't have to be a market one, but an example of how you've had to deal with an issue that was raised by one of the groups or people that you've worked with?
Okay. I have worked with a diversity of groups, right from businesses to governments, and therefore I can try to give you an example from business as well as from government. One of the examples that comes to my mind is that of a information technology company from India, which claimed that it had extremely good human resource practices. They qualified that they had good human resource practices because they had very low attrition rates, lowest amongst the industry standards, and therefore they believed that the company was doing extremely well. From a systems perspective, I saw that their human resource issues were not as simple as they made it out to be. And I recognized that because of the practices and the processes that they had in place, they actually had a lot of people who were unwilling to do the task at hand, or the costs of getting the task became very expensive, and therefore the company was having a lot of projects which were exceeding the time available to implement them in. As a consequence of looking at it from a systems perspective, I was able to actually identify the parts of the process or the interactions that existed between the human resources division and the employees needed to change. And by redesigning that set of interaction, we were able to restructure the way in which human resources operated in this company so that it got rid of the delays that they were experiencing and the high costs of the overshoot of project deadlines. As a consequence, the company grew phenomenally, and the process that we had changed became established as a sector or an industry standard and is now practiced all over in the information technology world. As a consequence, it allowed this company in India, which is now in the top three of India's information technology companies, to grow phenomenally. And it allowed the Indian information technology industry to grow phenomenally. So, this is just one way in which putting on the systems hat, you can transform how the world works. From the government, I can probably narrate a couple of examples, and one of them is the example where the government kept claiming that it is extremely difficult in order to identify individuals who claim government benefit. And of course, you and I know that every transaction that we enter into, we need to identify each other. In a small village, everybody knows each other, and therefore there is no reason to really worry about the identification process. But in cities, which are ever growing, and with the enormous amount of mobility that has come into our lives over the last 40 or 50 years because of the way in which the world has globalized, we increasingly know fewer and fewer people in our neighborhood. And therefore, each transaction requires us to be able to identify people. And therefore, governments have come out with different strategies in order to identify people. And sometimes people start looking at governments, especially, start looking at the idea of outsourcing identification to third parties. From a systems perspective, I was able to demonstrate to some governments that this is actually something which is the creation of risk and ensuring that identification would not happen. Because when you outsource identification to a third party, the two actors who are interacting are likely not to be able to identify each other because there is a third party who's not present in the transaction, which has been outsourced the responsibility of one of the main things, which is identifying the transacting parties. Simple way to look at it is in a school, you need to identify those children and faculty who belong to the school simply because you give them access to the facilities by identifying them. On the other hand, if it was a third party which was identifying them, there would be no way to tell whether this is actually a person from the school because this third party is going to use this identification mechanism for not just the school child and the faculty, but they're going to use it for social security, they're going to be using it for banking, they're going to be using it for taxation, they're going to be using it for transactions on e-commerce platforms. So it therefore doesn't necessarily say whether you are a bona fide member of the school or a bona fide claimant of social security, and it actually introduces a lot of risk. So simply by being able to recognize interactions and the purposes of the interactions, you are able to help identify what is the system that you are trying to intervene in and what are you causing the system to result in as a consequence? Are you reinventing the system in a different way? Or are you bringing in experiences and feelings in the system that are desired by the participants? Or are you actually causing them to experience something which they don't want, not desire? And so, therefore, it's fundamentally important to be able to do that.
If you've just joined us, my guest is Anupam Saraph. He specializes in systems leadership and is an educator in that field internationally. And we're talking about systems thinking and its application. It seems that so much of this depends on a willingness, an intention to actually address those issues. So what I wanted to head toward, Anupam, was that it seems that oftentimes if you have an organization that can say, yes, we're going to deal with this issue, we want to examine this issue and correct a problem or find a better way of proceeding. But for example, what comes to mind for me immediately is in the political process, if the political process itself is breaking down and there isn't a high level of functionality, or, if we say, okay, we have a democracy, well, how democratic is our democracy? And are those democratic structures actually functioning as they're supposed to? That there's always something in the process itself that it seems sort of like seeing the eye that is looking, like how are we prejudicing ourselves? And it seems that your methods for bringing this systems approach might help unravel that sometimes, so that we can't just have the assumption, oh, this we're calling it this, therefore it is this, when actually it might not function as it's originally intended to. How do you approach that when you're looking at specific issues?
Well, excellent question. I think let's start with the example that you just gave of democracy. And when you look at democracy, while there are many ways in which we describe it, we rarely look at it as a relationship between the representative and the represented. And when you look at it as the interaction that the representatives have with the represented, or vice versa, you recognize that this interaction is actually the one which is struggling in most democracies. Because the manner in which we look at it is we look at it as somebody who is elected to office and then makes legislation. And we have forgotten that the whole purpose is that of representation of the people. And as a consequence, what has happened is that often representatives may be misled to believe that they have to be elected to office in order to represent a group. And the representatives may also be misled to believe that they need to elect somebody to office in order to represent them. The essential function of democracy is to recognize that voices can be heard, that there is a freedom of speech, and there is an ability to be able to ensure that larger group of people can hear your voice. So if that were what we wanted to accomplish, and we wanted to ensure that nobody's voice is going to go unheard, even the minority will have a chance of being represented, we will look at democracy from a different perspective. And we would not look at it simply as a mechanism of getting elected to office. I think the nature of democracy has changed across the world over the last 50 years as information technologies have come to be. And today we have things which have become Twitter democracies. and Facebook democracies, which have unintended effects and unintended impacts. So I think it's important to help start a conversation, as I said, with the idea of who is interacting and for what purposes. So systems helps us to recognize what are the systems that we have invented in order to go about living our lives, and recognize that we have invented them and that we have the possibility, therefore, of reinventing them to serve the purposes of those who are interacting with each other, and to ensure that while doing so, we are being just, fair, we ensure the dignity and uphold the dignity of those who are participating, as well as those who may not be participating, and that we ensure there is equality and fairness in the process. So I think helping those who are participating recognize and be conscious about the systems that they exist in, rather than look at individual purposes, is an important part of the conversation and the methodology that happens in using systems thinking or bringing about systems leadership. Because one needs to recognize that we do not lead organizations, but rather we lead systems. An organization doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists because it interacts with others. And together they form a system. And therefore, if you were to talk about a leader, a CEO is a leader, maybe a leader of an organization, but becomes a systems leader when he or she can actually recognize how to lead the system that they are a part of.
And I mean, the systems are, depending on how you define them, I mean, many things are overlapping. So, we have a system of currency and finance, and we have systems of energy, and we have systems of ownership and property, land use. They could all, from my perspective, I could say, oh, I could call that a system, but I don't know if that's really a correct way of looking at it. But how do we know if we're looking at something that we're really defining the system we're looking at correctly, or at least in a practical, functional way?
Excellent point. I think we often use the word systems very loosely and in many different contexts. And therefore, we don't recognize what I mean by systems. So when I talk of the word systems, I essentially mean the relationship that you come to construct as a consequence of the interactions you have with others. And you have many interactions in the course of the day with others, but each of these interactions that comes together for a specific set of purposes is separated from the other interactions you have. So for instance, when you go as a buyer to a seller, you are forming a market system. In the course of the day, when you go as a learner to a teacher, you form another system, which is a learning system. When you go with the intention of hanging out with friends, you form a different system, which is that of friendship. When you go out to be with somebody with whom you are bringing up a family or bringing up children, you form a family system, which is completely independent from the other systems that you talked about. And so therefore, there are many such systems. On the other hand, when people talk of energy systems, they are looking at and tracing energy in an maybe a city, or maybe a company, or maybe a country. In a sense, when you start looking at things from a way which divorces it from the interactions that we divorce ourselves from really recognizing that our interactions are the ones which have invented the experiences that we get from the world around us. The energy systems are created because of our interactions with things and because of our interactions with each other. So, transportation systems are created because of our interactions with each other. We cannot look at them as vehicles moving around, but rather our need to come together at places where we need to travel to. So I think simply by divorcing the physical world from the world of interactions makes us lose the idea of why we do what we do, and to be able to recognize interactions as being what creates systems, or defining systems as collections of interactions that we have during a day, helps us to recognize the value of the why and the value of the purpose in driving our interactions. It also helps us to heal them. It helps us to recognize why we do it. And it helps to ensure that they give us the experiences and the feelings that we aspire for during our day.
That's I love that distinction of it. It's a relational system, that when you're talking about systems in your context, that it's about our interactions, our relationships, and it's also very much in trying to understand it or solve problems in it, is to really relook at the purpose and intent of that relationship. And that just is so clarifying. I really appreciate that. We're going to take a really short break, and we'll be right back with a more conversation with Anupam Saraph right after this. Don't go away. If you're just tuning in, my guest is Anupam Saraph. He is an internationally renowned educator and analyst in systems leadership. Anupam, you were just giving such a beautiful and clear explanation to clarify what we really mean by systems thinking and what a system is in that context, about relationships and purpose and intention. How might systems thinking inform our understanding of some current issues? So, I mean, I could think of a million, but just to hit at the heart of things, how about global warming? How can systems thinking inform our approach to that?
So global warming is a symptom. It's not really, a problem. It's the result of the interactions we have with each other and the interactions we have with our world. And really speaking, by ignoring the fact that global warming results from these interactions, will just keep us from stopping us from experiencing the consequences or the symptoms of these interactions, which is the warming of the world's atmosphere, warming of temperatures, all the climate extremes that go with it. So what are these interactions that cause global warming? I think the very first thing is the kind of lifestyle that we have. The interactions that we have requires us to consume. So we have built our life around buying more and more. And when we buy more and more, as a consequence, we are actually using a lot of energy, which is resulting in mostly fossil energy being burnt. and therefore carbon being released. Also, in order to be able to produce all of these goods and services, there's an increasing amount of land which is being occupied, forests being deforested, and as a consequence, the capacity of the world to absorb carbon is being reduced. Similarly, what we are doing is we are doing the same with water bodies, which have algae and fungi, which are capable of carbon sequestration. Because we start occupying these or reconstructing them, channeling them within cement concrete walls, what we do is we destroy the capacity that these have in order to absorb the carbon. So we are not focusing on any of these interactions. I'll give you a very simple instance. So for all the efforts that we have done over the last 28 or 29 years, that the Conference of Parties, the COPs, have taken place across the world, where the most brilliant minds of the world have come together in order to address the challenges of global warming. We have been talking about grand schemes of taxing people and doing whatever for, promoting the green economy. But take the instance of you and me in our day-to-day actions. Have we changed our interactions with the world around us that are different in over these 30 years? There has been nothing that has helped guide us to change our actions or recognize the consequences of our actions, because you and I cannot recognize how much carbon we emitted in our interactions during the day. So, for instance, if your car had a carbon meter, just like a fuel meter, you would have known that since the day you bought the car, you have emitted so much of carbon. Or you would know that today, by driving around so many miles, you have emitted so much of carbon. So you would know what is your carbon emission per hour or per interaction or per journey. This is something which is a very simple thing that could have been implemented over the last 30 years and would have helped millions of car drivers across the world to change their actions simply by being informed and by recognizing that their actions, their interactions with the world, are responsible for global warming or the symptoms of global warming. We haven't done it. And similarly, it's important to recognize that when you consume or when we consume any other goods or services, a similar indication of how much carbon we emit would help us to decide whether this is something I want to consume or I don't want to consume. But I think this is something that we have, a measure which we have not taken, and an easy measure which can help change the nature of interactions. By encroaching on different land, by encroaching on land which is likely to help sequester carbon, not knowing how much of this land we are encroaching on, not knowing what is the consequence of felling the trees that we fell, we simply are not able to make informed decisions about our interactions. So I think this is one simple way in which we can transform our interactions. In the case of global warming, for instance.
Yeah, just to have that feedback. And I know there's been discussion about, as simple a thing as requiring, very, very large corporations to actually provide data of their, carbon emissions, for example. And it seems like it's a long reach, and there's a lot of resistance to that. And there are actually a few technical obstacles, probably not terribly expensive, but they're there nevertheless, that are claimed that prevent us from getting closer to that. it's interesting to look at, the energy system or the transportation system in that context of global warming, and to say, wow, if you knew that when you bought this particular automobile, what is the carbon emission equivalent of that, just coming off the assembly line, you've already got a carbon footprint before you've used any energy to actually drive the thing. And I guess one could say, well, if we wanted to look at all the interconnected pieces, how much is involved in providing the roadways for that and the traffic signals and all the commercial infrastructure to sell and maintain and service automobiles. It becomes kind of a ballooning piece, which reminds me, the late philosopher and social critic Ivan Illich said that the nature of our systems of transportation were based on inequity and perpetuated inequity. And he went on to observe how much total time and resources society devoted to the automotive system of transportation, and concluded that cumulatively we achieved about 5 miles of travel for every hour of total social effort, a speed which is only slightly better than walking. And that's if you accounted for the entire cost to society, not just the individual driver. Would you consider that an application of systems thinking, or is that a different kind of analysis there?
Yes, I think it's a systems analysis for sure. And as I keep saying that, like every field, systems thinking has itself grown over the last 80 to 100 years. So ever since the idea of systems was floated by Ludwig von Bertalanffy in the early 1900s, I think different thinkers and practitioners of systems have evolved the way in which we recognize and design the systems that we are a part of. So while it's a great idea to look at how transportation systems have changed equity, it's important to ask the question, how have our interactions changed the need for us to travel different distances? So if you look at our parents' generation or our grandparents' generation, there have been different needs to travel beyond our village or city that we belong to. And so if you see the volume of people whose need to travel beyond the city in which they were born has increased gigantically.
Yes.
In less than a generation. And therefore, I think we need to question, why could the needs of these people not be satisfied in the city or the village where they were born? Why is it that they now have to travel vast distances in order to be able to meet their day-to-day needs? It's actually a failure of the design or the designs of systems in our neighborhoods that has caused us to actually move further and further or be mobile every few years. So it's not a reflection on the individuals, but rather it's a reflection on the way in which we collectively as a society have designed the kind of world that we live in. The whole idea of globalization has actually shifted our need to be local, locally self-sufficient, to being actually globally mobile. We have really transformed the way in which we need, when you look at purposes, then you start looking at systems from a different perspective altogether. It's no longer just about saying that, Is this transportation equitable?
Oh, I love that. To be able to when you look at it, as you say, you look from the point of view of purpose. Well, why are we? Why are people commuting from 65 miles away to go to work? And then we get into the issue of housing affordability, or we get into the issue of land use and how we've built our cities so that you can't really, in many neighborhoods, there's really no destination that's within walking distance. So it really is interesting to think of it in terms of the purpose and how we designed it so that it affects the outcome. In the United States, our per capita energy use has doubled since the 1960s. And yet, arguably, the quality of life in the 1960s here in the United States was enviable from a world perspective and certainly adequate from a domestic perspective. So it's like, why is so much energy have to be expended in order to have the lives that we want? And that comes back to the question of the design and the purpose and how the system is functioning or not. If you're just tuning in, my guest is Anupam Saraph. He is an educator and analyst in systems leadership who has worked internationally. Anupam, we have less than 10 minutes left. There's so much to discuss. You created the Earth Index, which is viewable at earth-index.info. What is the Earth Index?
Most of the times we have conversations about what's wrong with the world and what are the upsetting things that we are doing that cause more global warming, that cause a loss of biodiversity, that are causing more poverty, that have more wars. Somehow, when we focus our conversations around things we do wrong, we forget about the things that we do right. And the more we forget about the things that we do right, the less we do them. So therefore, it's important for us to focus our attention on what we do right. Also, it's important to notice that big change has usually happened based on what we decide to report. So, for instance, in the 1930s, when the idea of reporting the gross domestic product or the economic activity in a country was mooted, all countries suddenly started working for increase in their GDP annually. And since then, GDP has grown gigantically across the world. So if you look at this enormous growth, it was possible because there was a reporting that each country adopted and started monitoring. So it started driving its public policy based around the idea that it wanted to improve its GDP.
But the only thing that GDP measures is monetary exchange. So
it measures economic activity.
Yeah.
It measures basically what is happening in the land in order to produce the goods and services. And it doesn't matter what goods and services are being produced. So you can tear down a road and rebuild it and GDP will increase. You can build hospitals and GDP will increase, and you can build jails and GDP will increase. So,
has
but
nothing to do with quality of life at all.
It's got nothing to do, yes, but that's another matter. However, what did happen as a consequence of having GDP was we focused on increasing GDP because everybody was reporting GDP. On the other hand, because we don't have a measure for how livable are we making the world for us and for the future generations, we don't focus on livability. In fact, there is no government which has a ministry to make their country or make the planet more livable. And on the other hand, nothing can be more important for a government to do than to ensure that the country and the world become more livable. So we do need to have a way whereby we can invent a system that can actually drive the increase of livability of our planet. And with the idea in mind to seed the creation of such a system, I invented the notion of reporting the contributions countries make to the livability of our home, Earth. So, how does livability increase or change? So, livability, the contributions countries make to livability of this planet can be reported based on four interactions that people in the country have. And these four interactions are as follows. The first is the interactions people in a country have with each other. So if these interactions are fair, equitable, just, satisfying, non exploitative, then the people in the country are going to remain uh, in that country and not try and seek these interactions with other people in other lands. So, a measure of really looking at whether they are satisfied in their own countries with the interactions with each other goes to report the interactions people have with each other. The next interaction is the interaction people have with other species. So, the interactions people have with other species depends on what space we are willing to give to other people and to other species. If we are not giving other species any space, then obviously our forests are going to shrink. We are going to occupy every square inch of land in order to carry out human activities. So, reporting how the interactions with other species also helps to recognize what we contribute to livability. The third interaction is interactions with the ecosystems. So, if we carry out activities in our country, it create intensity. So, what is the intensity with which economic activity happens per square mile really decides whether we allow the ecosystem to regenerate and come back, or whether the ecosystem uh, is simply something that we don't care about. The less the intensity of this activity, the less our interactions care about the ecosystem. And the more we ensure that this is an interaction which does not have this high intensity, we ensure that our interactions are more caring about the ecosystem. And finally, the interactions with other organizations that we have created in order to ensure livability of our planet. So the governments, the businesses uh, are there in order to ensure livability. They don't exist for the purpose of profit, but they really exist in order to ensure that we can live our lives in a fulfilling way. And somehow, by being able to know if we are able to live this our lives in a fulfilling way, will help us to know whether these interactions with these organizations are contributing to livability or not.
Mm,
So I use these four interactions of people with each other, people with other species, people with ecosystems, and people with organizations in order to report what contributions countries make to the livability of our planet.
wonderful. We are out of time, and I want to thank you, Anupam Saraph, for coming on the show. And if you would just share with our listeners how they can find out more, anything that you want to refer people to learn more about the Earth Index or about systems thinking?
The Earth Index, as you pointed out, is reported on earth-index.info. So that's the website that you can go to and join the conversation on Earth Index. I would urge people to actually write about the Earth Index, to start conversations about the interactions that we have with each other, with other species, with ecosystems, and with organizations. Change the way in which we talk about the world by moving our conversations to talking about interactions. That's the first step to starting to think systems and to starting to ensure that systems are a part of the way in which we recognize how we experience and feel the world around us.
Anupam Saraph, thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.